Bienvenidos a El Cafecito del Día, brought to you by the Labor Council for Latin American Advancement. Our conversations are inspired by the moments of togetherness that nuestra comunidad shares over un cafecito.
Bienvenidos. We would like to start this episodio especial with a heartfelt thank you to the Labor Radio Podcast Network for inviting us to collaborate on the Week of Labor History Today series. Hoy, we share a conversation with Marla Ramírez, autora del libro Banished Citizens, a history of Mexican American women who endure repatriation. We explore the history of mass deportations, destierros, racial profiling, and the targeting of Mexican American communities during the repatriation era. In this conversation, we discuss how exclusionary policies shape generations of families and why remembering this history remains so urgent en el presente. Acompáñenos.
We invited Ramírez to join in conversation with LACLA's Carmen Rodriguez, the host of El Cafecito del Día.
To begin our conversation, how do you define banishment? En español es una palabra muy fuerte, destierro. And historically, how have governments been able to design programs, policies, and enforcement practices that effectively banish entire communities sin mencionar que se está desterrando a las personas?
The term banishment is central to my book, and it's a term that I came up with participants who I interviewed through oral history interviews for this study, because some of them were familiar with the term repatriation that has been used by the historiography to refer to the mass removals that took place during the Great Depression mainly. My book extends that timeline to look at the interwar period between 1921 and 1944. And so repatriation is a voluntary process of return to the homeland, right? So if immigrants are finding themselves in the United States, for instance, in this case, and want to go back to their native country, Mexico, as tracking the US-Mexico movement of this mass removal, the immigrant has to initiate that request, and then the Mexican government steps in and provides the monetary help for return, repatriation. But it's not an adequate term to define what happened to US citizens who were entangled in these mass removals. And those US citizens were the children and wives of Mexican immigrants who were initially targeted for that removal. So banishment is the coerced and sanctioned removal of US citizens from the native country to their usually ethnic designated home country. So in other words, Mexican Americans as US citizens were already in their homeland in the United States during the interwar period. And when they were removed or coercively removed to Mexico, they were banished and then forcibly relocated into a foreign country, the country of their parents or grandparents, but not their own.
You mentioned in your book that in early 1930s to 1944, there were some conditions. So what conditions made removals, deportations possible? And in your research, what social, political, and economic factors and what specific tactics enabled the large-scale targeting y expulsión de mexicanas y sus hijos?
Definitivamente, there were specific tactics that were grounded in the economic crisis during the interwar period, so 1921 to 1944. Most of the books that have been published about this topic focus on the period of the Great Depression, but my book looks at the period right after the end of World War I that faced an economic recession after the war, and then those effects were intensified obviously during the Great Depression. So I look at this longer period, and during that 1921 to 1944 period, both the Mexican government and the US government were affected by the economic recession after the war and then the Great Depression. And they were looking for avenues to be able to create economic recovery projects. In the United States, the mass removal of Mexican American mixed status families that included US citizen women, Americanas, and their children who were also US citizens was the approach to remove entire mixed status families as we know them today. They are composed of members who are immigrants with different legal statuses and US citizens. and targeting women and children who were US citizens facilitated the mass removal of entire family units and prevented the return migration of men if they were to be removed individually because they had ties to their US citizen children and wives and were more likely to come back to the United States. In fact, that was the approach at the beginning, and then the tactic changed. While there was no change in naturalization or immigration law for these mass removals because they were described as voluntary by the US government, the 1917 Immigration Act was used to justify the removals. And the 1917 Immigration Act essentially states that if an immigrant becomes a public charge after 3 years of their arrival into the United States, then that is grounds for their removal. And so that was used as the language to then justify these mass removals. But obviously, the US citizen women and their children, they were not immigrants in the United States. And even if they were labeled as public charges because they were dependent of relief aid at the time, they were not deportable as citizens. But removing their husband and then using an outdated conversion doctrine, an outdated law that was brought back to state that women belong with their husbands and children belong with their mothers. So in other words, conversion doctrine essentially states that the political voice and political rights of women are subsumed by that of their husbands upon marriage. And so even though that law existed during the 19th century, but was no longer existent in the early 20th century, the legacies of the law and the understanding that women belong with their husband and children belong with their mothers was used to then say, if the head of the household, who's a Mexican immigrant, who is labeled as a public charge, is being removed, then the wife and the children who are understood to be economically dependent on the head of household must also live with that provider. That obscured and discursively ignored the legal rights and protections entitled to US citizens under the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, and ignored due process and civil rights for citizens. The Mexican government, on the other hand, also was invested in these mass removals that included US citizens of Mexican origin because they saw these families as a potential promise to help the Mexican nation come out of the economic crisis after the war and out of the depression during the Great Depression. They romanticized the labor skills that these families had gained in the United States, and the Mexican government, under different presidents, created the discourse that their skill set that they had gained in the United States in agriculture, mining, railroad construction, and maintenance will help industrialize the Mexican nation and help the nation also come out of the recession and the depression. And so both governments then did not make any changes in the law. They simply ignore the legal protections entitled to US citizens because they saw benefits, economic benefits, to come out of the recession and depression at the expense of US citizen women and their children and mixed status families as a whole.
This has been a part of a broader pattern in the US history. How have these cycles of exclusion and removal shaped the Mexican American community over time? And how do you see similar patterns affecting a las comunidades latinas, a las comunidades mexicanas, a las comunidades centroamericanas today?
I argue in my book that indeed this way of understanding mixed status families that erases the legality of the members who are US citizens and assumes that the entire family is undocumented in the United States has been used time and time again since the period that I write about, the interwar period. Today, we see conversations again about removing entire mixed status families, right? We see US citizens being detained, being interrogated, and even finding themselves abroad because due process continues to be ignored. And racial profiling continues to be used as a way to identify those who are understood to be US citizens and those who are imagined to be undocumented immigrants. Under the former Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, she was asked, what do we do with undocumented immigrants who are in the United States and are in mixed status families, right, who have US citizen children and US citizen wives? And one of the responses that the Trump administration provided was we deport families together, right? Instead of creating ways to protecting mixed status families and allow them to remain together. The goal under this administration is not to keep families together, but to remove them together, similarly to what happened during the interwar period. Christenum also highly publicized the self-deportation, quote-unquote self-deportation or program that she led, inviting people to voluntarily remove themselves from the United States. And if they fail to self-deport, the consequences will be so grave that they will have no other way to adjust their status if they were caught and deported. So those are echoes of what happened during the interwar period, right? And legacies of these earlier programs of mass removals that ignored due process and did not protect U.S. citizens and mixed status families, that now we again are hearing these ideas of self-deportation as voluntary, as a benevolent process that if you leave, then you are allowed to come back eventually to go through the quote-unquote right way. The families who were banished during the interwar period that I read about were also told that they were going to be removed for a year, and then they could come back after a year once the economic crisis had reduced. They could come back to the United States. Obviously, that was a false promise. It proved to be a guidance, and they were not allowed to come back for decades for most of the families. Some took 60 years for them to come back. Some took more than 40 years, 46 years to come back. So that's another potential consequence that we need to be worried about in the current moment, that what happens to the families who are being targeted and unjustly removed and whose due process, constitutional rights and civil rights are being ignored, will have prolonged consequences in generations to come, similarly to how the families that I write about and work with endure these prolonged consequences in the flesh many years after the Depression and the post-World War I economic recession.
Indeed, as you mentioned, we've heard former DHS Secretary Kristi Noem say things like, we are not deporting your citizens' children because they must be with their parents or their mother. But what is the lasting impact of these policies on families, especially for U.S. born children of immigrants who often grew up feeling like they don't fully belong here, pero tampoco pertenecen ya to their country? How these past banishment practices shape the experience, and how is that dynamic continuing today?
That's exactly at the core of my book. The prolonged consequences that are still endured by U.S. citizen children who are still alive today, right? Multiple generations after these mass removals. And what I theorize is prolonged consequences based on the lived experiences of the families that I interviewed. I call this process an imposed transgenerational illegality. That these mass removals that entangle U.S. citizens and denies their protections under the law creates generations that are discursively described as undocumented immigrants. So the removal displaces them geographically, right? Because they're banished, están siendo desterrados fuera de su país. So they're displaced socially, but legally they're also robbed from the legal protections, but the opportunities entitled to U.S. citizens if they remain in the United States. Many of them did not have access to formal education. They did not have access to learning English. They did not have access to other opportunities that could have been given here if they remain in the United States. And so when they came back 16 years or 46 years after their banishment, they had to start from scratch. And so they were catching up in learning English if they had access and time and resources to attend adult education or community colleges. But some of them remain Spanish-speaking, monolingual U.S. citizens. And because they did not have access to the workforce here or in the education, formal education here, they enter the minimum wage workforce in the United States. So they had to either work themselves up or got stuck in minimum wage or under minimum wage job sectors. So that interrupted the potential of multi-generational wealth for families. Some of the families who were banished already had homes here, had businesses here, and that removal meant that the descendants, their children and grandchildren, had to start from 10 steps behind what they had before that removal.
When I was reading your book, I felt like traveling in time between the 1930s and between today. And a striking question raised in your book is about enforcement on the ground. In the 1930s, how did immigration enforcement officers actually distinguish between an undocumented inmigrante indocumentado and U.S. citizen of Mexican descent? And what does this reveal about the role of race and appearance in enforcement decisions?
In the earlier period that I write about in 1921 to 1944, it was what we know today as racial profiling, that people were suspected to be here as unauthorized immigrants or undocumented immigrants because of their skin tone, because of their race or their ethnicity, because they spoke Spanish or other language, non-English language, right? So those were grounds for suspicion that they were not American or not American enough. And during the immigration raids between the interwar period, immigration officers assisted by local authorities would create these mass raids in public spaces, dance halls, schools, courtrooms, very similar to what we see today happening. In these immigration raids, people were questioned and they were asked to produce proof of legality or legal permission to reside in the United States. People who were questioned were people who were not white passing. That means that Mexicans and Mexican Americans were white passing because the diversity of skin tones and phenotypes in Mexico is very wide, right? So there were some that could pass as white, so they were usually not suspected and not interrogated. But those who presented or had darker phenotype, and dark hair, darker skin, who were speaking Spanish in public, they were more likely to be interrogated regardless of the legal status, regardless of the generation, regardless of any threat to the immigration system. And many times they found themselves arrested and sometimes removed because they could not produce proof of their legal status on the spot. They did not have any documentation with them and on the person to prove that they were here legally. They were US citizens who have some kind of immigrant visa. One Filipino man was interrogated in Los Angeles, California, suspected to be Mexican because the phenotype of Filipinos sometimes can pass as Mexican and vice versa, right? And he found himself removed to Mexico and then carried the burden to prove that he was in fact a Filipino national in the United States and had to create a case to be allowed to come back to the United States because he was not Mexican as he was suspected to. So these are the cases of racial profiling that we saw then, that we continue to see today. And that will continue to happen as long as the immigration enforcement in the United States continues to rely on biases and stereotypes rather than on legal processes.
What lessons should we take from that ambiguity today, given how easily citizenship status was overlooked or dismissed in the past? What risk do current communities face? ¿Cuáles son los riesgos que ahora también enfrentan nuestras comunidades when enforcement relies on similar assumptions or discretionary power?
Even though programs of mass removals are sold as benevolent or are sold as having a benefit for the majority, right? In the current moment, we are hearing immigration officers, the Trump administration, and even local governments selling or publicizing a rhetoric of mass removals as a benefit for citizens because of the economic crisis that we're facing now, because of the inflation that we're facing, because other competing factors that mean that resources have to be divided between citizens and immigrants in mixed status families, so that then they come to understand mass removals as an economic solution, very similar to what I described in the 1921 to 1944 period. But the lesson is that even though in the surface they might seem as a benefit, in reality and in practice, it has really detrimental effects, not only for people who are being removed at the time, but for later generations. And also, it's a slippery slope. If we agree as a nation to turn a blind eye to due process and the rights entitled under citizenship and birthright citizenship, then that means that right now, the people who are being attacked are immigrants and citizens in mixed status families. But if we allow those rights to be denied or to be ignored, then other citizens are also at risk, that they might not be protected under due process, or their citizenship might also have less weight under the law because we have a law other groups of citizens to have those rights broken or ignored. So it becomes a dangerous slippery slope.
Thank you so much, Marla. Ha sido un placer y un honor share this conversation with you.
Muchas gracias, Carmen. Fue un placer platicar contigo. Thank you for the time.
The history we explore today is not just a record of what once happened. It's a warning. When those in power seek to maintain control, they often do so by dividing communities, by labeling some as outsiders, and by pushing others out, desterrándolos, whether physically or socially. Remembering this history is not just about looking back, it's about recognizing these patterns as they reappear and understanding what's at stake if we fail to challenge them. To all LACLA and union members and labor allies, we must continue demanding respect for the rule of law and for the basic human rights, especialmente cuando nuestras comunidades son atacadas and when our siblings are detained arbitrarily, denied due process, or treated as less deserving of dignity and protection. History reminds us una vez más that silence allows injustice to grow. Solidarity is our greatest strength, and we must stand together to defend one another against fear, division, and exclusion. También tenemos que estar listos for the upcoming election. Our vote is power. The ballot box is where we can begin to rewrite our history and help change the course of our nation. The future is not written for us. It is written by us. Nos escuchamos en el próximo Cafecito del Día.
El Cafecito del Día is part of the Labor Radio Podcast Network.